Hello, this is Derek Hansen for StrengthPowerSpeed.com, and this is our 19th episode of our Performance Concepts Chat. This episode, we're joined by Brendon Ziegler of Cal State University Bakersfield. He's the head strength coach, assistant athletic director of performance, and he is joining me to talk about sort of the state of strength and conditioning, and whether it's collegiate, professional level, and how people, I think, are looking for other ways to separate themselves or maybe get attention and maybe not be minding the real basics of the profession, whether it's basic stuff like getting people stronger, getting people faster, making them more resilient. And it's very difficult. I think these days we're distracted by technology, as is everyone, and maybe sometimes we see that as a way to make us look a little more efficient, a little more trendy, a little more hip and up on the technology, because society's heavily influenced by what's happening in the technology field. So why not in strength and conditioning? Other things are happening in terms of these blurred lines, in terms of, are you doing performance work? Are you doing rehabilitation work? Are there therapy aspects? And we talk a bit about a particular situation, and I'm pretty careful. I want to make sure that people are honest, but at the same time, I kind of muted some names that were mentioned, and I'll let Brendon talk a bit about the example. I don't know if it's necessary to call people out, but those people aren't here to defend themselves, so kind of muted the names. You want to do some investigation, that's up to you, but I don't think necessarily that I'm providing a forum for people to be kind of called out, and so that was my personal choice. I didn't feel comfortable with it. That's another discussion, maybe a private discussion with different people, but I did want to have him provide some examples of what he thought was maybe out of bounds in the profession. And so, I hope you get something out of this. I've known Brendon probably since about 2008, 2009, when he was at Oregon State, and always been very impressed with the amount of work he puts into researching what he's doing, what others are doing, and just trimming the fat and getting straight to the point of how do we make people better. And that's tough. It's very tough. It's not sexy, doesn't sell, and the basics rarely do. But there are some people who are committed to doing things that are fundamental. And I know myself, I'm spending a lot of time telling people just to run straight and forward, and sometimes that's not enough. People don't think that just running fast in a straight line is enough, and maybe it's not. But I think we could all get better at doing that. And so that's a bit of the area that I focus on, and so we're all crusading a bit in terms of trying to get our ideas across. And I think just listening to Brendon, I think, is a very sobering experience in terms of trying to, especially if you're a young strength coach, trying to line up where you should be and what you should work on. So hope you enjoy this talk with Brendon Ziegler, and definitely is going to raise some questions. So hope you enjoy this episode. Hey, Brendon, it's good to talk to you. And I know, like many people, you're very busy and you're in the midst of things here now. But I wanted to talk to you about some specific issues in strength and conditioning. And I know you're a very intelligent guy, well-read. You keep up with things. You try to stay ahead of the curve. So I thought you would be one of the best people to talk to about some of these issues. But before we get started, can you give everybody a bit of a background on where you came from, what your sporting background was, and then how your career has evolved over the last, say, 10, 15 years?
Sure. First of all, Derek, thank you for having me on. Hopefully I can lend some good to the cause here today. My background is I was a very average athlete growing up, played a lot of different sports, but ultimately kind of chose football as the sport that I really put the most time and effort into. And from an early age, I knew that based on my average athleticism, I needed to do something a little bit different. And so I gravitated towards strength conditioning to give me a competitive edge. And so from a very early age on, I started moving into the weight room. I think I wandered in the weight room at seventh grade and started playing around a little bit and tried to get information everywhere I could. I first started off with probably bodybuilding magazines and things like that. And finally, I got a little smarter in the early ages of the internet. There was a site called allprotraining.com and had a little NFL strength conditioning coach contributions to the cause and adopted some early training methods that way. I went to college, Hamlin University, chose it largely because I wanted to become a strength conditioning coach. Was able to work for a guy named Chris Hartman, who became our strength conditioning coach at the time. And he had a private business as well as being our university strength conditioning coach. And he worked out of a gym called the Press Gym. And I don't know if you remember Zuba's pants at all from the 80s, but the guy had invented Zuba's pants.
Wow.
And he used the money to buy this gym. And it was like a hardcore powerlifting bodybuilding gym that he was a part of. But my strength conditioning coach was running his business out of that as well. And from an early time in college, I started interning with him. When we kind of got to my senior year, I knew I needed to do an internship. And one of the things that we had talked about was doing it at an NFL team. And we had talked about doing that, and I had something lined up. When I was talking with people from my hometown in Edgerton, Wisconsin, somebody told me, hey, you have a strength conditioning coach from Edgerton, Wisconsin. And I said, well, I didn't know he was a strength conditioning coach. I thought he was an athletic trainer. And that was Eric Helland. And so I delayed my trip to the NFL and checked out the Chicago Bulls. And it was there I became an intern with Al Vermeil and Eric Helland, and really helped establish kind of my philosophy and training and what I use going forward from there. From there, I worked at University of Wisconsin, worked with football, assisted with hockey and a couple other teams as well. From there, I went out to University of Hawaii as a graduate assistant, assisted with football, worked with men's basketball, tennis, and assisted with some other sports like volleyball and baseball. And from there, I was hired at Oregon State University, worked under Jeff Macy, who at the time was an assistant strength conditioning coach with the Bulls, became the director of strength conditioning at Oregon State, brought me to Oregon State. I was there for quite a while, worked with men's basketball, men's and women's golf, and assisted with football. It's there I met my wife, who was the assistant softball coach at the time. And Chrissy, she's a much better athlete than I am. She played softball at UCLA, was one of the top recruits in the nation in softball in high school. She played in UCLA, won a national championship up there, and became a very successful coach at Oregon State. And later we migrated down to Cal State Bakersfield, where I became the school's first ever strength conditioning coach. And Chrissy became the head softball coach for the school. So That's kind of where we're at today.
Okay. Now we have to go back. We got to talk a bit about Al Vermeil, Eric Helland, and that environment, and more details about what was the day-to-day like. And I know Al pretty well, and
Sure.
That must have been a pretty great place to learn. And he's a straight shooter, so he's always telling you exactly what he thinks. How was that?
One of the most fantastic things I think they instilled in from day one. I walked down there, expecting a lot of different things. The first thing they talked about was your time here should be spent developing a philosophy. And to me, that really is important, because when I developed the philosophy, I was able to interpret the information I saw there and information moving forward. And to have a real solid philosophy is what they imparted on me day one. And that was kind of stealing their philosophy. The better athlete is the one that applies the most force in the shortest period of time. And so moving forward from that, I was able to watch the training of the athletes, contribute wherever I could, change Al's weights, everything I could to try to learn from those guys. They exposed me to a little more refined technique than I was used to. I think the coaches and the information I've been around the past was okay, but as far as refining weightlifting technique, refining sprinting technique, really becoming a great coach as opposed to being somebody who just kind of throws out exercises and expects people to do them. So it was fun just to learn from those guys. Eric had NFL guys from the Bears early in the morning. We were able to watch those guys train. And then kind of throughout the day, we experienced the NBA guys at different stages of development. You might have young guys who are doing some serious heavy training, and you might have some older veteran guys who are kind of in a little more maintenance mode. And then, of course, in the afternoon, it was Al's time to train, and I stuck to those guys as much as possible, trying to take every little bit of information I could from those guys. And then, obviously, with Al's experience bringing in consultants, the best weightlifters, the best sprint coaches, the best physical therapists, I was able to kind of take whatever information that they had available and based on that, try to do as much reading as I could, try to watch as many videos as I could, and then ask as many questions as I could. And that, to me, has been the biggest influence in my career, is that experience.
Yeah, and it's great that you have guys like Eric and Al that are very accomplished, but yet they never thought, "Hey, we figured it all out." We got to bring other people in, and we got to keep that standard of excellence up there. And that's part of the philosophy, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. And what impressed me the most in that is that they're all lifelong learners. They are able to say, yeah, we don't have all the answers. We have this philosophy. And based on that philosophy, they brought in people with similar mindsets that brought something a little bit different and unique to the table. And they were able to kind of take the best attributes from those different consultants, different disciplines, and bring together, I think, a training system that really made a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's great. And now we're looking at the strength and conditioning profession, and it looks like from to the outside person, the lay person, we have guys making over $500,000 as strength coaches and football coaches and other coaches saying, like, the reason we're doing so well is because of this strength coach that we have. So from the outside, it looks like a great profession. But you've seen a broad array of environments and scenarios, and what do you think of the strength and conditioning profession as it is now? Are we in a good place?
Well, I think on some level, I love the fact that strength conditioning coaches are making more money. I think there's nothing wrong with that. But I think we have to be careful we temper the expectations of what we can actually do in the profession. I think in rank of importance, obviously the player, the athlete, is the most important. And Al always used to said, great players make great coaches. And that's very true. And I don't think there's any substitution for great athletes, great players, and a high amount of skill. Coaching, I think, between head and assistant coaching in the sport realms is extremely important as well. And they far outrank the strength coach in importance. And I always kind of find it kind of curious. Sometimes head coaches called their strength conditioning coach the third or fourth coordinator, and they rank them right there with the coordinator. And I think that's a little bit much. I have a very unique perspective in the fact that my wife is a head coach. And the stresses that she deals with as a head coach and my stresses as a strength conditioning coach are completely different. And when I leave the weight room, yeah, I'm kind of thinking about things I can improve upon and make the athlete better. But as a head coach, they have to deal with the academics. They have to deal with lifestyle issues. They have to deal with all these different things that a strength conditioning coach hasn't even touched. And so I just out of perspective, I can remember a few times where my wife has gotten a call with an athlete with mental illness, and we've had to drive down to the mental illness clinic because there's a suicide threat. And as a strength conditioning coach, you think your job is important. And until you've experienced something like that, you realize that you're far down the line there. And although you really can master that physical preparation area, there's so much more to sport and life than just sprinting, lifting, and drills and things like that. So I think in matter of importance, we're down the line a little bit. And I think that people need to have that perspective when they talk about how important a strength conditioning coach is. So that's my thought on the matter.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm sure, we've all had that point in time where there's a team that we've worked with and they do well, and you're kind of like, oh yeah, like I had something to do with that or whatever. But yeah, when you step back, there are so many variables, right?
And so much is that is dictated by the head coach, from the players they recruit to the culture they create, the organizational structure, to the autonomy they let the strength conditioning coach have. So much of that is dictated by coaches that I don't think we can take that much credit for the success or failures that we have. So I think we got to be careful with that.
Yeah, and I know, having worked as a track coach where I was in charge of everything, it's a very different circumstance. And yeah, when you become a strength coach, you do have a very, well, relatively narrow scope of practice relative to what a general sports coach would have. Now, having said that, the modern strength coach seems to have evolved into what I would call the Renaissance man of sports.
Sure.
And no disrespect to female strength coaches, but and sort of a jack of all trades. People trying to get into, and maybe this is part of the profession where we get people handling therapeutic things, rehab things, maybe nutrition. And I don't know where all of that falls in or who should be handling, parts of that. But, I think what's happening is everybody wants to make themselves the most valuable person they can be. And and also we get into sport technologies and data collection and sport scientists and all that. Do you think that's somewhat diluting the actual role of the strength coach?
Sure, and a couple things with that. I think number one, strength conditioning coaches should have general knowledge of all those subjects. I think that's really important. I think it's kind of analogous to a basketball coach, and maybe they run a motion offense. They know a little bit about the Princeton offense. They know a little bit about the triangle. They know a little bit about a transition offense, but they don't employ all those different techniques, all those different tactical, situations. And so a strength conditioning coach, I think, should be no different. I think we should have knowledge of what good therapy is. I think we should have knowledge of what good nutrition is. The problem is when you reach a certain threshold of all those different things, then absolutely you start diluting what you're doing. Just like the basketball coach can't run, 10 different offensive systems. There's just so much time and energy and attention that can go into one of those. And to me, if you're spending too much time across the board, number one, you're probably not mastering any one of those disciplines. But number two, you just don't have enough time to coach and teach all those different things. You just don't have the time to manage it. That being said, I think a lot of that's happened because, early on in the profession, a strength coach may had, 8 or 9 different teams, and now we're down to one team with 15 people. And to justify importance, we're looking for different areas where we can kind of say, I've got some influence here as well. And I think people are trying to make themselves more marketable. I think they're trying to step in areas outside their scope of practice. And I think we got to be very, very careful that, we have an understanding of what's going on. We know what good nutrition is, good therapy is, good coaching is. But we have to stay in our lane too. And I think that's an important part.
Yeah, and I know we've had this discussion before, and I tend to be an advocate of like getting people to run and sprint, and because I see a lot of situations where that's not really being done. They might be diverting it to other things like the stuff we've talked about. So, I mean, you've probably seen that too, where, maybe the domain of the strength coach is the weight room. Maybe it is some on-field stuff or on the track. But if that's not being minded and people aren't doing it right, like I almost feel like I have to go to the extreme and say like sprinting does all these great things just so that people will do basic sprinting. Do you find the same?
Yeah, I think that's very true. You have to almost sensationalize what you're doing to make it important to some people, because you're right. I think some general physical qualities are being ignored, and we've got all these gaps in a mission that we're spending time with kind of sexy technology. We're spending time with different areas, and quite frankly, we can be most impactful with things like strength, things like absolute speed, reactive ability, things like that, where we can really make a solid change, are kind of being ignored because it's not the end thing of the day. And obviously, we want to market ourselves, but at the same time, we can't ignore what the profession is all about. The profession is built, by people like Alvin Roy that brought this great thing to sport, and it really worked out well then. And why are we trying to change dramatically what it brought in the 60s and 70s? So.
Yeah, and I was having a talk with an NFL strength coach, and we were talking about sprinting. He says, I don't think a lot of people do sprinting. Like there was one case where some guys wanted to sprint, and the strength coach would only let them sprint if they pulled a sled or a band or push something, but they would do no naked sprinting. Like it had to be loaded all the time, which I thought was wow, really, but that's the mentality to some degree, right?
Yeah, and I think so. And I think there's so many strength coaches out there, especially at higher levels, that are so afraid to create an error of commission that they create 10 errors of mission. And so you have people who are afraid to sprint at full speed because they're afraid of pulling a hamstring. And so they just ignore it. There are people that are afraid to load heavy because they're afraid someone's going to get hurt doing it. So they avoid doing it. And so they look to fill those gaps with cute things, with things that are impressive to the athlete, to the coaches, and that's the route they go down. I think that's a faulty route to go down.
Yeah, well, that gets to my next question here. How do we evaluate the efficacy of a strength coach? And, maybe you and I can do it, but, does the coach know? Does the general manager, the athletic director? What are the indicators or measurables that you would use to evaluate a strength coach,
Yeah, and I think that's a tough one because there are so many parts of our job that are subjective, but I think there definitely has to have an objective piece to it. I think you have to have certain physical qualities that you outline with your sport coach that say, okay, these are the physical qualities that are important to our athletes. And so we need some objective testing to really determine whether or not we're making improvement, whether that's a vertical jump test, a static or counter movement vertical jump, whether that's some sort of strength test, whether that's some sort of upper body strength test, conditioning test, definitely a speed test, a 20, a 40. And I think that needs to be done, and that needs to be tracked longitudinally. And that way, at any point, a sport coach, an administrator can go down and say, okay, what have we done over the past 2 to 3 months? And we have that hard data to be able to say, yeah, we've made improvements, and here are the improvements that we've made. That being said, I think there's a big part of the job that is subjective. The student athlete has to have a good experience in the weight room, on the field, on the track. There has to be a great relationship going on with the head coach, assistant coach, and administrators. So I think a big part of that subjective piece are things like communication, your ability to fit in with the organization, the alignment between you, the head coach, the culture that they're creating are all very important things. And so sometimes I think that objective piece gets left behind because we found somebody that fits within the alignment of our organization, who gets along with our student athletes, who doesn't create problems. And so as a result, we've kind of left behind that objective physical piece that's such an important part of our profession.
Now, do you think we do a good enough job advocating for ourselves to others, like advocating to coaches or educating them on what a good strength and conditioning coach does? An administrator like a general manager or an athletic director, do they have enough knowledge to make those assessments? And if not, how do we get that information to them, or how do we advocate for the profession?
Yeah, I don't think they do. I don't think they have the ability to assess who's a good strength conditioning coach and who isn't. I think a large part, they lean on their coaches for evaluations. If the head coach is happy, generally they're happy. If the athletes are happy, they're okay with it. So there needs to be some education somewhere along the line. I think, presenting at conferences like NACDA, where athletic directors go, would be a big important step in that, to say, hey, make sure that we've got some data to back up what your strength coach does in the weight room, track, field, wherever. Yeah, we know what a lot of those subjective qualities are at athletic director level, but what physical pieces? How can we tell our athletes are in shape, and how aren't they? Unfortunately, a lot of that is also due to the head coach as well. because we don't have the autonomy to play or not play individuals. We're not the ones recruiting those individuals. So I think that's also got to be a consideration as well. We're just an extension of that program. And so all those factors are a little bit tough and tricky to kind of play out in terms of evaluation.
Yeah, and being in sort of good standing with your coach or your wife is pretty important as part of that. Now, have there been situations where you've had to kind of go outside of that relationship and challenge a coach and say, look, I don't think we're doing this right? And have you ever thought that your job was threatened because of that, or you had some problems?
I don't think my job has ever been threatened
Yeah.
because of it. Obviously, at home, that's a good kind of conversation we have, and we have those conversations every single night, and
Yeah.
we don't agree on everything,
Yeah.
but we're able to come to consensus pretty well. With the other coaches in our athletic department, other coaches in my history, yeah, there's times when I step in and say, we might need to change something, and I think the way you handle it with tact is really important. If you're able to do that, come at a coach with a good solid reason, a good solid rationale, and a thoroughly developed argument for what you're doing, I think most of the time they understand it and they go with it. Now, there are times when, again, the head coach says, I want it this way, and whatever the head coach wants, we'll do it as long as it's safe and as long as we can provide that from a resource standpoint. Because ultimately, wins and losses aren't attached to a strength conditioning coach's record. Ultimately, we're not in the newspaper when things go well or when things don't go well. And so I think you have to realize that we're there in a supportive role, and ultimately, whatever the coach wants, they're going to be able to do. And again, that's within reasons of safety and resources and things we can provide. So I think my role as a strength coach and as a husband of a Division I coach, you realize really quickly that the pressures at the coaching level are much, much higher than they are for the strength coach. So you realize those types of things. And so there are things that we acquiesce on that may not be ideal in our world.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm sure there's cases where you've seen something where, although it might be safe and you do have the resources to do it, but it's just silly that
Sure.
sometimes we go along with it,
Yeah,
so and,
absolutely. Sometimes you have to bend with it. So
yeah. So, okay. So extending from that, I mean, in the field today, you're pretty observant about what's going on and what you see. What do you see that you like? Like, have you seen somebody speak or present, or have you gone somewhere and seen somebody coach? Are there some things out there where you're like, okay, this profession is going really well because of that person, or where that's going?
yeah. Yeah, and I think with the internet, with social media, with all these different things, we're bringing together a lot of different disciplines. I think that in terms of coaching the movements, whether it's sprinting, whether it's lifting, I think some strength coaches are doing a better job with that. I think with the prevalence of things like CrossFit, I know no one really loves CrossFit as a strength conditioning coach, but I just think of 15 years ago in our profession, you couldn't find anybody doing weightlifting. And now you could go down the street and do it. And as a result, we have a lot of coaches that are much better teaching because of it. We have a lot of athletes who are more exposed to it at an early age. And so although I disagree with a lot of things they do, it's brought some great things to our profession. I tell our athletes all the time who walk in with their own weightlifting shoes. When I first started weightlifting, I had a tough time getting weightlifting shoes, and now they can drive down to Dick's and pick up a pair. So, there's something to be said for things like that.
Yeah, that's true, because I remember you'd give a workout to a kid and they're going away and they're like, I can't go to the local community center and do snatches or cleans, but now they can
Sure,
find somewhere.
absolutely. I was reading Kelly Starrett's book last year, that Supple Leopard book, and one of the things that made a lot of sense to me was teaching by the archetypes that he's kind of laid forth. And so he's got different positions, whether it's an overhead position, whether it's an RDL position, whether it's a squat position, and he kind of teaches off of those positions. That was a concept that Clete McLeod at Nebraska kind of brought to me in terms of sprinting as well. And when you take a look at somebody sprinting, you're kind of going through in your mind and you're thinking, okay, they're hitting those positions. They're hitting the right hip extension, the right amount of knee flexion, the right amount of dorsiflexion. Where are their hands relative to their body? Mm-hmm. And when you see somebody sprinting, you kind of go through that checklist in your head as to, they're hitting those positions. And I think that some coaches are starting to finally understand that in terms of all movement, that there's some basic fundamental patterns that I think are critical to sport. I think the next piece of that is figuring out what the correct speed, what the correct force, what the correct velocity is. And I think when you combine, position and velocity in the right combination, you've got good movement. And so I think more and more strength coaches are starting to figure that out. So that's fun to see.
Well, it's interesting. Like I know, and it might just be me or how I was taught, but I think for the most part, when you see something and it looks right, like you can spot something. Like good sprinting is very easy to see and recognize. Good direction change. Even people lifting sometimes, you can just kind of glance and you're like, okay, that looks good. Do you think that's something that's innate? Do you think that maybe that's been trained out of us to some degree? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that's something that's trained into us, and obviously some people have it naturally, but I think others really have to develop it.
Okay.
And I think that you can watch from a very early age that some people have mastered movement really, really well. From even a toddler and a young child who's really got movement down, you see others that really struggle with it. And I think there are a lot of environmental factors. The fact that we're sitting a lot more, the fact that we're texting, the fact that we're on computers has really affected the way we do things. But also the fact we're not doing much manual work anymore. At a very young age, my job was, working on the farm, working on different things around the house, doing a lot of manual labor. And I think you just don't see a lot of that anymore. Mm-hmm. And so I think a lot of those qualities are being kind of pushed out of us. But at the same time, I think we can, as strength conditioning coaches, improve a lot of those different things. And so we have a lot of tools to be able to do that.
Well, even on a physical education level, like some of the private sector guys I've been talking to, they're kind of recognized as the ones responsible for the kids' movement now because at the schools it's not really being minded as well.
Yeah, and I think that's an area that we can improve greatly. The physical education system was set up to basically prepare people for the military, and we've kind of outgrown that initial reason for starting it. And so why can't we tell people how to run properly at a very young age? The importance of posture, the importance of eating right, warming up, cooling down, all those types of things can be taught at a very young age. What's the importance of good thoracic mobility? And I think if you understand it at a very early age, you're much more likely to continue forward. In physical education's current state, I think it's kind of worthless. Yeah. Teaching people how to play pickleball and things like that, that's fun, but I mean, what value does that really have? And until someone kind of straightens that out, I see those programs, continue to get cut and pushed aside and positions cut because of that. But I think that's a great area where we can improve. Okay, how do you lift at a very young age? How do you run at a very young age? What are the importances of good health habits and good wellness habits? And I think that's a definite area of improvement that we could have.
Well, maybe that is a role or a void that strength coaches could fill, where they go to professional development events for teachers and kind of walk them through some of these things, because I don't think that is part of the curriculum, or there's not that expectation. So maybe we have to go out of our way to provide that guidance.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be a strong voice that's going to have to push a lot of people who have been in those positions for many years toward that new direction.
Yeah,
I think that cutting those programs and cutting those positions is going to kind of force their hand. But I think we're a little ways off from that happening yet.
Yeah, I think you're right. Now, getting back to the strength and conditioning field, we talked about some things you like, some things that are happening. Are there some things where you're shaking your head and going, I don't think we should be going in that direction. I don't really like that aspect of where people are pushing in the strength and conditioning field, or it causes you some concern?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different areas that we're heading that I don't think have been thoroughly vetted yet. I think there's a lot of new methods, new techniques that we're very, very early to adopt. And I think we got to be extremely careful with that. Another direction is I think we see strength conditioning coaches continue to go more and more toward kind of the therapy end of things. And I'll give you a story. There was a minor league club in town who has a strength conditioning coach who contacted me and said, "Hey, I've got this course coming into town. We're teaching it right here in Bakersfield. We'd love to have you there at it." And so I said, "Okay, I'll do it." It's significantly discounted, and it was the Reflexive Performance Reset course. And I think the proprietor of that is and the test basically, it was the program was going to reset your performance. And so I didn't know what to expect going into it. And so it was taught by a track coach in Illinois, a guy by the name. So he gets up in front of this group of strength conditioning coaches mostly. There were a couple physical therapists and some physical education teachers and other people who were there. And so he talks about, the amazing things this system is going to do. And so right off the bat, he just starts talking about how people's quads are doing way too much work. The quad is not supposed to flex the hip as much as it is, and that's because we have an inhibited psoas. So he gets a volunteer and, gets up kind of brash and, he's going to, show how screwed up everybody is, and he's going to fix them instantly. And so right off the bat, he gets a volunteer and, he starts going through and does kind of a Psoas test on a table where he's got the athlete lying down and turned the foot out and he's pushing on the leg. And I was at a clinic at Simon Fraser when you were there and witnessed Don Chu calling somebody out for something similar. And he pushed down on the foot from a hip flex position. He was putting minimal pressure on the opposite ASIS. And of course, after an intervention, he goes through and he pushes down hard on the opposite ASIS, anchoring the hip down and creating much more stability. And so, of course, we call him out on it. Mm-hmm. And, he basically had kind of defended, well, we need to make sure that the psoas is active. And I said, well, quite frankly, the quad's job is to flex the hip to a certain degree. And so there was some argument back and forth. And after a while, he basically admitted that this was a parlor trick. And a great deal of this reflexive performance reset was parlor tricks. And the biggest benefit that this had was placebo effect. And so not only are you trying to mask therapy as a performance reset, you're using a placebo effect to do so. And I think that encouraging strength conditioning coaches to start doing manual therapy type maneuvers on people, I think is a bad practice. If you can imagine a strength coach in the weight room with her hand down a female athlete's bra trying to hit a sternal reset, I think that's a bad practice on a lot of different levels. And if you're talking about an administrator going down and seeing that, I think you'd be worried about a number of different issues with that. Number one, you got to make sure that you're doing this safely. And within that 6-hour course, I don't think that I was confident walking out of this course knowing I could do it safely. With massage, there's a lot of things that manual therapy, there's a lot of things that you can do wrong that can hurt or even kill people with it. Mm-hmm. Whether you're causing a blood clot or knocking a chunk of plaque free from a carotid artery, there's a lot of different things that can go wrong, and none of which was discussed. They've carefully chosen language that absolves them of criminal issues, but not civil issues. And you're not backed up by insurance. You're outside your scope of practice. And to me, that's not the job of a strength conditioning coach. I get where there's times when pain does not exactly parallel with dysfunction or injury, but that's not a strength coach's job to be able to remove that kind of issue from what's going on. That's the job of a therapist, of a trainer, a doctor, and there should be multiple people around. There's checks and balances in the medical system for a reason, and we can't decide to be judge, jury, and executioner when it comes to figuring out if there's something wrong, trying to do a treatment, and then throwing them into exercise. So I think that was one of the things that alarmed me the most in our profession is our movement toward type things like this. I've gotten a lot of calls from people in universities who said, hey, we're bringing this course to our university. And the one thing I tell them is, number one, you shouldn't bring the course to the university. You're putting your strength coaches in a bad position with this. Number one, they're going to make the athletic trainers upset. They're exposing themselves to civil liability. And quite frankly, I don't think it works very well. So based on those three things, courses like that, you got to be careful with. I think it's important as a strength coach to have a very firm philosophy. So you can say, hey, my job is to help increase the force, to help increase the speed, not necessarily to pull them back from injury. So,
yeah, and I mean, I don't have any personal experience with that technique, or I've only heard what people like yourself have told me. But I would think that if you're doing your job well as a strength coach in terms of your loading and your warm-ups and activations as part of just conventional movement, and maybe doing some stretching flexibility work, I would think that would be enough to not have to resort to some of these things. And the other part of it is, how much time do you have, to do this extra stuff, right?
Yeah, no question. And I would rather put my time and energy into methods that are pretty well proven. One thing that I consider myself, I'm an optimist in terms of new things, but I'm also a pragmatist. And so I want to put my time, energy, and effort into things I know that work very, very well. And unless it's been well researched, well used, I don't want to take the chance in hurting somebody and spending my time in something that doesn't work. I'd rather put my eggs in a basket that I know it's going to bring something to it. And a lot of these methods are new, unproven, and we're not really confident that they're doing what they're saying they're doing. So to me, they have to be well researched, well vetted before we even touch it. So.
Yeah, and I was always very gun shy about people our coaches bringing in external people, like, oh, there's this yoga instructor that my friend knows, because again, you don't know what their skill sets are, you don't know what potential responses they could create, and on top of everything else. So yeah, I think we have to be pretty careful about that.
Yeah, there's a kind of a big trend right now, and I think everybody is trying to market their piece of this. And there's a big trend now and a big sales pitch. I think when you're talking about a lot of these methods, they'll go up and they'll use confusing terms.
Oh yeah, explain that. Explain. I love this.
Yeah, and so I think that if you're making up new words to basically present your system, all of a sudden I'm throwing a red flag up. I call them neologisms. And if you have those new words that you're making up, arthrochromatic responses, reflexive resets, if you're starting to come up with those terms, I'm a little bit apprehensive. And then if you're presenting the system in kind of this dogmatic, I can fix all, you're really screwed up, that kind of thing, then again, I'm really a little bit concerned. And there's a lot of systems right now that are starting to go with that same approach. So I think strength coaches have to be aware and be very cautious when they're doing things like that. So,
yeah, that's true. There's a lot of techniques out there that are saying that you're all doing it wrong, or we've lost the ability to do something that we should reflexively know how to do, right? And maybe that is a sales pitch, and I think it goes over well with people for some reason. I don't know. Maybe we do feel detached, or like we're missing something that maybe from an evolutionary point of view should be there. I don't know, but it's definitely part of a lot of sales pitches.
Yeah, you make people feel inferior, and you make them feel like there's some sort of dysfunction, they're falling apart, and then you say, I have the cure. Unfortunately, a lot of people will fall for that, and that's pretty prevalent right now.
Hey, it got a president elected. Anyways, as far as your professional development, aside from these types of events, like what else are you doing to make yourself better on a daily basis? And what advice do you have for some younger guys in your situation who are entering the field? Where would you push people to really learn more?
I think it starts with good awareness. Good awareness of what you're doing, what your athletes are doing, where are they deficient. I think that really helps you kind of aim the direction of your learning and where you're able to kind of better yourself. Because I think there's a lot of different areas you can expand in, whether that's becoming a better coach, sometimes becoming a better person. I think that strength coaches aren't exactly known for personality. And so there's a lot of avenues for improvement there as well. But, whether that's speed development, whether that's knowing what you're doing at a macro level and knowing what you're doing at a micro level, things to develop team culture, there's a lot of different avenues you can go down. But I think it starts with having enough self-awareness to figure out, where are we deficient? Where can we go? But I think no matter what, the one thing that I've learned from Al and Eric is you have to be a lifelong learner. And that's such an important part because things around you are changing all the time. What I knew as a strength coach, 15 years ago and what I knew now are completely different. And so I think the more tools you can arm yourself with are the better. And the more you can understand what everybody else is doing, I think helps you understand what you're doing as well. So even if you choose not to implement a certain method, a certain technique, a certain discipline, at least you can pull that understanding out of it, and understanding the contrast of what you're doing, what they're doing is a little bit different, but there's some advantages to both. So
that's a good point. And even the course that you described, like, maybe it doesn't hurt for people to attend those things and kind of think about it and reflect, and is this useful? But they don't necessarily need to go out and try to do it. But
and going back to the basketball coach analogy, again, I may be running this motion offense, but at some point I'm probably going to face a transition team, so I'm going to have to defend that team. And so just knowing enough about it that you have some level of understanding, I think, is important for a coach.
Yeah. Now, I want to finish a bit with basketball. That seems to be an area where you're having some success. What is it about basketball that you like in terms of providing the strength and conditioning? And, I may go back to the experience with the Bulls, but that seems to be an area where you're excelling right now.
Yeah, we've had success in a lot of different areas in Bakersfield. But basketball has definitely lately been a big success. And I think, number one, again, it starts with your head coach, developing a good culture, developing good players, getting good athletes. And that's been big for us. And then having a system that allows them to thrive. So again, we take Al and Eric's system of, starting very slowly, using a lot of progression, starting with exercises they can have success with early and not get frustrated. A lot of people will take a look at a 7-foot-tall basketball player and try to put him on the ground for power cleans day one. But if you do that, they're going to get frustrated. They're going to get hurt. They're not going to enjoy their experience in the weight room. So if you can start with really, really simple tools, simple exercises, and have success with, they're going to be much more likely to enjoy that experience. Nobody learns how to read by throwing a Tolstoy novel on the lap. Like, that just doesn't happen. Learning doesn't happen in big chunks.
Yeah.
So with those guys, it's just encouraging them to choose things that are successful. We choose loads and exercises they can excel at. And then based on that, we really try to encourage great culture, great training environment. The basketball guys here love training. They don't walk in the weight room thinking, oh, man, it's on a lift. We went out in the soccer field today, and they weren't dragging out there saying, oh, man, we got to run more tempo runs today. They were having fun doing it. I think that's an important part. Once they start seeing the success they have from a physical development standpoint, once they start seeing their 20-meter sprint times drop, their vertical jump go up, and then later when they see the improvement on the court, they really are bought in.
Do you spend a lot of time creating like that educational point for them and explaining what you're doing, why you're doing it, how it relates, and creating some context for them and all the training?
Absolutely. And more so now than ever. I think early on in my career, I've kind of ignored the human element. I was all about sets, reps, exercises, technique. But we start with now just, values. We want to be very on purpose. We want to be very intentional in everything we do. And we kind of hold those values over their head day one. And then as we kind of explore the exercises, we relate them very quickly to what they're doing on the court. And I always tell our coaches too, if you can really provide some context for exercises. So for instance, they're struggling to get a rebound. If they can say, well, if you did some more pull-ups, if you were stronger in pulling exercises, you might have had that rebound. If you're a little bit stronger overhead on a push press, a jerk, you might have had that tip dunk, that extra point. And that goes such a long way into getting them bought into what they're doing. Because if they have that link established, they're much more likely to buy into what you're doing. So
Awesome. Now, we're going to finish with something that's not on my list of questions, but I remember you telling me a story when you were younger. I think you were at Oregon State, and you did like a whole bunch of reps of something all day. And I just want to show people the commitment you have to learning and experimenting on yourself. Could you go over that, what you did again?
the 100 rep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think I originally got the idea. Jeff Macy was our director at the time, and he had talked about it in the Dan John workout. He was talking about 100 reps of clean. It could have been clean and jerk. So I attempted 100 reps of clean jerk at 100 kilos. And so for all week long, I just picked one exercise and attempted 100 reps at it. And just as an experiment, again, I wouldn't try it with an athlete because I think it's a stupid idea to try with an athlete. It was probably a stupid idea that I tried it myself. And it took me a while. It took me, I want to say, 2 hours to finish those 100 clean and jerks.
Wow.
But the one thing I encourage everybody to do is at least try something yourself before you start having your athletes do it. I think that's an important thing because you don't want to put them in a situation that you found out was not unsafe because the volume, the intensity, the difficulty was inappropriate. And so if you do it yourself, at least you have some empathy for the athlete and you know exactly what they're feeling. So I'm not afraid to try a lot of different things. One of the reasons I got into sport and competitive weightlifting is because I wanted to learn how to do it better. And so that's why I pushed myself into it. But again, I'm not afraid to try something to make sure that I'm not putting the athletes in a position where they're going to fail because I don't think that's right.
That's awesome. Well, thank you very much for your time, Brendon, and I'll be catching up with you very soon, I'm sure. And I just love hearing what you're doing and why you're doing it and all the reasons behind it. You do a good job.
Absolutely. Thanks, Derek. Anytime.
Okay. Thanks, man.
All right. Bye.
So again, I thought, that was a great discussion. Really enjoyed talking to Brendon and seeing where his head is at. And, maybe it is a sobering discussion that we all have to have amongst ourselves and what should we be focusing on. And, some people may think some of the stuff that Brendon says is controversial. I just think sometimes we need to talk about these things and maybe get people back on track. So, I'll let everybody else decide. I just thought it was worthwhile experience talking to Brendon. And if you have any questions or comments, you can get us on Facebook at Strength Power Speed and Twitter at Strength Power Speed with no vowels, and also obviously on YouTube. And, even if you just hit us up on the site. But I hope you enjoyed that. And, if you have any issues or want to raise any questions about what we talked about, please do. And we'll see you next time on strengthpowerspeed.com. Thank you very much.